So I would like to start now with introducing our first speaker. Our first speaker is Professor Eric Lambin. Eric is a professor both at Stanford University and at the University of Louvain in Belgium. And Eric has been the chair of one of the projects that was running before the Global Land Project. In fact, it was called the LUCC, Land Use and Land Cover Change Project. But at the same time, Eric is also an example of a real land system science scientist. He comes from research working on deforestation in tropical countries, observing deforestation by remote sensing. But during his career, he has moved much further to a more land systems perspective, including human dimensions of land system science, and also looking at governance aspects. And that's why we gave Eric as a title for his talk, Land Use and Land Cover Change from Tropical Deforestation to Coupled Human Environmental Systems. Floor is to you, Eric.
Okay, thank you. So, because I'm the first one to speak, I think on behalf of all of us, I think we should thank the organizers, Patrick Hostad and Peter Verboek, for putting all this together. I think we're going to greatly enjoy the meeting. So my charge was to talk about the origin of land system science, as it is called today, because I don't feel quite ready yet to be relegated to the past, to history. I will also talk about some recent progress and looking forward also what are the issues ahead of us. In the 70s, our colleagues had very peaceful nights. They could enjoy this absence of stress because they had this very simple view of the world. They were mostly concerned about the role of forests in the carbon cycle. And the notion at that time that was population growth was clearly the major driving force of land change. In the 80s, this view got refined slightly, and that's the time where we were predicting future deforestation just based on distant roads or these kind of simple spatial metrics. And I'm afraid it's really in the 90s that we start to mess up things quite badly because we start to identify that everything was complex and you had this multiple interaction between proximate cause and underlying driving forces. It was never just one factor leading to some land change. It was always this configuration of multiple factors interacting. And it's really in the year 2000 that a more systematic kind of system view of the world has been developed with a greater range of land use transformation being taken care of, intensification, urbanization, and others. And also the key concept of ecosystem services was integrated into the land change field, and the impacts of land use change were therefore also developed in a much more refined way. And therefore, also in terms of response, the concept of vulnerability, resilience, adaptation became very prominent. But most importantly, it's at that time that really the feedback from this transformation, impact of this transformation became quite important, and the feedback on the driving force, and that's really where this concept of coupled system became quite important. Now, having developed this system view of land systems, then we start to study some nonlinear dynamics that are related to these feedbacks. And one of the first one that was really studied is the so-called forest transition, where at the national scale, after multiple decades of net decrease in forest cover, there's a turning point on the blue curve here, which shows the forest area with a rapid increase in forest, or at least in tree cover. What's very remarkable on most of these curves is that as the forest cover was increasing, the blue curve, the cropland area was also increasing. So this was just a substitution of cropland for forest. Something much deeper is going on in terms of transformation of the land use system. And if you see at the the bottom panel, the blue chart shows the increase in total food production. So it was there was a net increase in forest cover while food production was increasing also. So something more deeper was going on, and one of part of it was a spatial reorganization of land use at the national scale. Kind of a better matching of actual land use to the land use potential, which is shown here for Vietnam, where both on the remote sensing data and on the census data, you see in red areas of deforestation, and in blue or green, the areas of net forest cover increase. So even though at the national scale there's a net increase, you see that you have this reorganization of land use at the national scale. And a bit later, we became aware that this process of redistribution of land use is also taking place at the regional and even international scale. This is just for Latin America, a group led by Heidi and others, some in the room, that have quantified change in vegetation cover at the level of municipalities. And in blue, you see the municipalities with a net increase in woody cover, and in red, a decrease in woody cover. And what you see is that as some regions, like Costa Rica, are increasing their forest cover, some other regions absorb the land use that is being abandoned in this other region. And trade is reorganizing that land use at the national scale, allowing for some regions to increase their forest cover while others actually increase cropland expand in these other regions. And so that led to this concept of land use displacement, that through trade we outsource, or more rigorously we offshore our land use to other regions. One of the first studies that really showed that quantitatively was some work we did with Patrick Meffroy on Vietnam, where Vietnam was one of the first countries with these policies, land use policies, command and control policy through land use zoning and logging ban to protect forest. But at the same time as Vietnam was protecting its forests, it was also increasing the import of wood and timber from other countries, in some cases legally, and in some cases it was an illegal trade. And we could quantify what fraction of the total forest cover increase was actually compensated by this offshoring of deforestation, about 40%. The same kind of pattern was found for most of the other forest transition countries, showing that really trade has a major impact on land use nowadays. What's driving this displacement of land use? Well, clearly it's the land use regulation in some places that make it much, that decrease the accessibility of suitable land, but also the fact that the stock of underutilized land is not homogeneous across the globe. Some countries have very large stocks of land that could call the land reserve or underutilized land. We decided in a small group that Holly Gibbs and I led a few years ago, just 2 years ago, we decided to call this potentially available cropland. So that's the area of productive land that's currently underutilized, that could be converted at a low social and ecological cost rapidly for rain-fed farming with moderate capital investment. And that's really a key variable in land use, because that's determine where can we displace land use with while minimizing the negative impact of land conversion on society and on the environment. And for a very long time, we've all relied on global scale statistics that have been published and advertised by FAO for many years on where that that potentially available cropland was based. In that project that Holly Gibbs and I led, we tried to quantify this area of surplus land by using a much more refined approach. Rather than working based on global scale models and just removing what's not suitable, what's already cultivated, what's protected, we had what we call an hectare by hectare approach. Now, that surplus land is concentrated in less than a dozen countries. So we took all of these countries and we started to map in a very detailed way what's really available among that stock, what's really accessible, and what land would be associated with a very high cost in terms of carbon emission, biodiversity, or social costs if that land would be converted. And when we integrate all these factors, in fact, we found much less land that was actually publicized in the previous year, anywhere between a third to a half only of the land that's there. So it's really important at this point, because land use displacement becomes such an important process globally, to get a very good understanding of where that land is and what's the cost associated with the conversion of that land. And one conceptual model to see that is that basically the amount of land that you can evaluate as being accessible for conversion is really related to the social and ecological costs that you accept for that conversion. And as you increase your estimate of the stock that you can convert, therefore, solely the cost of converting that land becomes very high. So you want to stop before that inflection point. Now, as you do this assessment, the more constraints and trade-offs you take into account, the lower your stock will be there. And that's basically the process we've done. This also points to a very key variable, is land prices. The best possible indicator of some land scarcity would be land price, and we found as we're doing that there's very little consistent database that has been tracking land price globally and over time in order to identify how close we get from that threshold. Why do we need so much land? A very key insight that was derived from a study I did with Jimena Rueda just last year. We're looking at the major crops worldwide, and we made the distinction between the stable crops, the rice and cereals, or the cereals that really feed the hungry, and all the non-stable crops. And very interestingly, while the total production of all these crops has been increasing very much, for stable crops, most of the increase in production was associated with yield increase, intensification, with very, very little expansion, as you see on these bottom curves. The ones that are really associated with an expansion and therefore a conversion of natural ecosystems are really the non-staple crops, soybean, oil palm plantations, coffee plantations, etc. And so this is really telling us that all that deforestation, all that conversion of ecosystems did very little to feed the hungry. It mostly contributed to the diet of the rich, of the urban population in rich countries and emerging economies, a diet that's very rich in fat, in sugar, and in meat. That was really the driving force of both of these conversions. So that so-called trade-off between feeding the hungry and conserving nature is not really there. It's not really shown by this data. The world system has really been transformed by globalization, and that made that possible. First, on the supply side, there's been a great liberalization of trade over the last trade and investment, actually, over the last few decades. But also the supply chain of these commodities got much more concentrated in the hand of a few companies. For most of these commodities, you would have a situation where 5 to 6 major corporations control from 60 to 70% of the trade in these commodities. Also on the demand side, there's been a major evolution of the diet and of the lifestyle, of the urban Western lifestyle has been globalized and has been driving the demand for these commodities. While most of us were focused on these commodities that trade in very high volume, we kind of neglected this other set of commodities that are kind of anecdotal in terms of volume, but that are traded in very, very high value. So these are the niche, the commodities for the niche markets, such as acai, or quinoa, or sheep butter, or argan oil. Globally, they are kind of insignificant, but for specific places, they really be transforming land use because they are sold on external market at such a high price. So these are typically targeted for the urban market, again, of the rich and emerging economies. And there's a whole realm there of commodities that do deserve to be studied a bit more carefully. One such study was done with my colleague Yann Le Paulin. We focused on the argan woodland in southern Morocco, which is an endemic forest that's where most of the argan oil is being produced by crushing these nuts from these trees. Argan oil is being sold on the luxury market at about $300 to $400 a liter. It's really, really high price, and they are being bought to these farmers at less than €1 for the same quantity. And yet, because you have this niche market, this great demand, this had transformed completely the landscape. And it could be either way, it could be an incentive to better conserve forests, to maintain that capital, or actually it could be an incentive to overexploit and just harvest, mine the whole resource very quickly. And whether it will be one or the other depends very much on the land tenure system and the local institution. In that case, the local institutions were such that there has been an over-harvesting and a very rapid decrease in the tree density for that woodland. Because all these studies point to the fact that international trade in these agricultural and forest products is becoming a major driving force of land use change, it has major implications on governance. Now, the traditional land use governance, the command and control, land use zoning, protected areas, logging bans, are not effective at promoting a common good. As you protect a province or forest in a country, you just displace land use to other countries. And there's no mechanism to avoid that. But at the same time, another set of instruments for land use governance have appeared over the last decade. And these are all the demand-driven or market-based instruments that try to harness trade in order to promote some values, some sustainability values. And I'm referring here to eco-certification, to all these commodity roundtables that have been promoted by WWF, some market exclusion mechanism, moratoria on soy, on palm oil in some place, etc. So how effective are these systems in promoting different land use, more sustainable land use practices? Well, to answer this question, we need quite a different research design. As land change scientists, we have been trained to think in terms of place-based research. Typically, we pick a place and we collect all the data, and anything that's happened outside that area are kind of external conditions. Now, to really understand the influence of this market force and this private governance mechanism on land use, well, you need now to pay much more attention to the supply chains. These are the set of the chain of actors that link a place of production to a place of consumption. And by studying the supply chain, you can try to understand whether the signal that's being sent by the final consumers, that is, this preference for high quality, certified product, is being transferred to the producers, and whether the signal does influence land use practices. This is some of the work we've started to do. This is with Jimena Rueda again in Colombia, where we looked at the impact of Rainforest Alliance eco-certification of coffee in Colombia. Now, that price premium that's paid to the farmers that do get certified is quite small, from 2 to 20% of the price of the price of mainstream coffee. And that premium really depends on the total price of coffee. And yet, with that very small market signal, we could document a major reorganization of the geographic reorganization of the coffee production in Colombia. The province, the regions that were better equipped to be eco-certified because they were already meeting some of these criteria, they were also already dominated by shade-grown coffee, saw a much larger increase in coffee production, while the other regions for which the cost of getting certified would be very high, actually saw a decrease in coffee production. And this was based on an econometric model that therefore we control for all the other factors that influence the increase or decrease in coffee production. So still, the effect of that price premium was very important on the whole geography of coffee production at the national scale. So this shows you the power, the strength of these market signals on land use decisions. A slightly more complex version of this study was done with Rachel Garrett on soy from Latin America. In Brazil, most of the soy, is that mine? No, hopefully not. My daughter calling, maybe. The market, the supply chain for soybean are separated, distributed between the GM, that's mostly GM soy, mostly sold for China, and the non-GM, mostly sold in Europe. But what Garrett has shown is that Rachel has shown these producers got a very high market share with the European consumers. Therefore, they also become much more exposed to the preference for European consumers for sustainable soy. And the rate of adoption of various eco-certification schemes among these farmers that were selling non-GM soy to Europeans was much higher than compared to the other regions that were selling this GM soy to China or other places in the world. So you see how these trade relationships can also affect the ability to adopt some of these sustainable practices. Okay, and to wrap up, so I think, again, looking forwards rather than just looking at the history, what I've shown is that as we were doing this research, we came across the fact that land price, that is something quite crucial, actually, when you think about it, for land change science. We do not have a global, consistent database of land price that would tell us actually a lot about how much land is available and what's the pressure on that land by which actors. And I mentioned also for these niche commodities that have been kind of not really studied in great depth, and yet they do have a major impact on land use. Other issues that our research has uncovered that really require more attention: labor markets. Increasingly now, with urbanization, labor, the cost of labor has increased quite dramatically in a number of places, with rising wage and people migrating from one place to the other, and how multiple labor markets are interlinked with land cover chain, and how there's a massive migration of people to provided labor is, again, an issue that does deserve more attention. Always in the theme of globalization, migration and the remittances that are being sent back to the villages also seems to be a major factor these days of land use change that, again, is linked to globalization, as is the diffusion of new norms and values and practices, often in these countries as being communicated via the NGO network. And finally, we start to study the role of private regulation, private mechanisms to influence land use, but it's very clear that the effectiveness of an eco-certification system depends not just on how it is designed, but it also depends on what's the institutional context in which that eco-certification system or other private instrument is being implemented. And again, that's a new area of research that I think does require much more attention. Thank you very much.